Welcome back, and many thanks for staying with us on the number one breakfast show in the country, Morning at NTV. My name is Romeo Busiku. I have Susan Kaiser. She is from the Chartered Financial Analyst Society of East Africa. And I also have Mr. Peter Chambade, a tax expert from KPMG. We shall be talking about financing the budget through taxation, that is with Mr. Chambade, and through financial markets with Susan Kaiser. Very good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning.
All right. And now, how best can we finance our budget through financial markets? And when we talk about financial markets, what do we mean? Do we mean the banking system, the equity markets, Uganda Security Exchange, the NASDAQ, New York Stock Exchange? And how can all those go a long way in financing Uganda's budget, especially the Uganda Securities Exchange?
Well, basically, when it comes to financing the budget, the government usually does it through the treasury bills and bonds, through borrowing from the domestic market and also borrowing externally through other sources, like, for example, the IMF. They've got some support to do because of the COVID restrictions. They've got a loan from the IMF. So it's mostly through borrowing, through the treasury bills and bonds market locally. Yes, that's mostly how the government raises money to finance its budget. Yeah.
Peter Chambade, talk to us about how government finances the budget through taxation. How does it happen?
When it comes to taxation, first of all, good morning, viewers.
Yes.
When it comes to financing the budget through taxation, the country does several measures, physical measures. And some of those physical measures, of course, are to see how they increase the tax rates, how they increase the people who are actually paying tax, so putting through measures that would widen the tax base. Then also looking at measures that will improve the tax administration, because once tax administration is improved, currently our tax to GDP is very low, which means there are so many people who are supposed to pay taxes that are not, and as such, increasing and improving administration would help.
And then the question, at the back of the mind of the viewer who is watching Morning at NTV is, okay, there are some people who are not paying taxes. The question is why?
So
they lost their jobs?
A number of people are not paying tax. Yes, some people may have lost jobs. However, it is important to note that when it comes to taxation, you pay tax when you make money.
Indeed.
So if you do not make money, like you have lost a job, then you would not be taxed. However, there are many people who are actually making money that are not within the formal
tax
sector. And in that case, they're not paying tax, which they should have paid, however little it could have been. And then you find that the burden lies on a few, like for example, employees. Because as an employee, your income is known, your employer is obliged to withhold, and you find the burden lies on a few. But if it could be widened, and everyone who pays tax, who's supposed to pay tax pays, then probably you would find the burden would be lower.
So here's the fact, Peter Chambade. Over 899,000 Ugandans lost their jobs from the onset of the pandemic in 2020, that is March. 899,000 Ugandans have lost their jobs. So would it be wise to tax a dead body or someone who is already on oxygen?
So thank you for the question. 899 persons lost their jobs. And what that would mean, that, as you have put it, it's like a dead person because they are not earning anything.
Indeed.
So to the extent that they are not earning anything, then they cannot be taxed. The only aspect where they could be taxed, because directly, when you are earning, then definitely the income you are earning is supposed to be taxed as long as it's above the threshold. The extent you lose your job, then you cannot be taxed because you no longer have income. However, from another angle, we have what we call indirect taxes, like VAT, like excise duty, which you pay when you buy something. So you do not feel that you are being taxed directly. Now, for example, you had income, so you are paying pay as you earn. But now, you no longer have that income, and as such, since you do not have it, there's no direct taxation, but there's indirect. So when you say taxing a dead body, yes, a dead body could be taxed.
But it's not ideal.
It's not ideal in a way. But as long as they have purchase, that means they can only be taxed if they have purchasing power. That means if they go out to buy sugar, there will be VAT in it. Or if they buy a product where excise duty was included, then they would have paid that excise duty which has been extended.
Here's what we are saying. What we are saying is that Ugandans do not have the purchasing power right now. They do not have that money to go and purchase these products. And the people who are making these products wouldn't go to the banks to borrow for loans, which will later on circulate into the economy, because the first person who would have purchased their products is actually at home and they are grappling with no work. Don't you think this analogy actually works? When Ugandans lose their purchasing power, the people who produce these products or commodities do not borrow from the banks.
That is very true. And probably that's why you see the trend of tax collection has also gone down. Because, yes, because of the pandemic, a number of businesses have been affected, a number of individuals, their income has been halted, and as such, definitely the saturation and ability to purchase and ability to pay has gone down, which eventually impacts the entire chain. The people who would have bought are not able to buy. The people who are producing are not able to produce as much as they would because the people who are buying are not buying as much. And as such, if they are to expand, then they may not be in position to go and borrow because they will not be in position to service the loans as they would. So that's why we are seeing that there's been a trend of reduced tax collection.
Indeed. So was it a mistake by government to introduce these new 7 tax measures, knowing very well that the purchasing power of Ugandans has reduced? Now they are introducing these new tax measures. We do know that out of the 44.7 trillion budget, 22 trillion shillings is available for spending. Now, out of these 22 trillion shillings, 20.8 is coming from the taxes courtesy of URA. So you don't see the problem there, Peter?
Of course, I would.
You know very well Ugandans' purchasing power has reduced. And you have 22 trillion available for spending. And out of that 22 trillion, 20.8 is coming from taxes, knowing very well there's no tax base.
The analogy as you are saying, when you look at it, could make sense. However, we also need to note, as I have said, that yes, we have a budget and it has to be financed from somewhere. And as we stand now, the level of tax to the GDP is at about 13%. And then government is also in a catch-22 position. Yes, we need to finance the budget, provide specific services to the different stakeholders. But at the same time, we are also having the issue you're saying, that a number of people and a number of businesses are finding it difficult. And then also we are looking, I hope you have heard, in terms of our debt as a government, it has gone up. It's almost reaching the levels which the 50% mark, which in many instances we should not pass.
Which will hit 51.9 in the next financial year.
So now, when you look at that, so the issue is, what can we do as a country to see, to the extent we can, get taxation? As I said, getting taxation would be for people who have made money. And of course, when we look at this budget, yes, there are a few measures that have come through to raise revenue. And some of the few measures that have come through, I would have issues with them as to the impact. For example, the data tax of 12%, which in my view would have some impact in growth of the economy, in growth of the employment, because many of the young guys are now using IT to create for themselves jobs. And most of the businesses are using IT and internet to do business.
And now you have a 12% tax on the internet.
Yeah, so that, in my view, from a policy perspective, the people who did that policy did not think through the long
Peter
term.
Jambade is an expert, a tax expert from KPMG. We also have Susan Kaiser. She is from the Chartered Financial Analyst Society of East Africa. She's acquainting us on how best we can finance our budget through financial markets, treasury bills and bonds. We'd like to know how that works. You just give us a hint on what government does. They sell the government treasury bills and bonds. But how do they actually work in going to facilitate or finance the budget? We want to know how the money trickles back into financing the budget.
It's basically the same way as if you would borrow money from a bank, that money would come to you. So basically the government does sell the treasury bills and bonds to the public. A lot of it is taken up by the banks and a little of it is taken up by individuals, but most of it is taken up by the banks.
How do the banks access it and how do individuals access it?
It's through, okay, that's an interesting perspective. It's through, you have to have an SCD account and if you a lot of the major banks are participating in this. So if you as an individual want to buy treasury bills and bonds, you can buy through your bank, yes. And then the banks who do buy directly from BOU. Yeah.
So we would like to know, the president actually did call for a new cabinet. We have some 34 new ministers. And we would like to know whether this is Uganda's best human resource to curtail this problem that we are dealing with.
Well, it's interesting, like in Uganda, we usually criticize our leaders, but we find that given the current situation, I think our government, the people within government have responded favorably, looking at the circumstances. Because when we look at the situation of the COVID situation, has meant reduced revenue from taxes. And you know this means, of course, if you have reduced revenue, you still have expenses and you have to borrow more. So this is not just a Ugandan problem of having to borrow more. It's more of we're expecting generally more borrowing and increased taxes generally across the board in most areas in the world. So this is not just a Ugandan problem that we need to borrow more.
It's not really a Ugandan problem, but the fact is that other countries that borrow money, they'll use it for the intended purpose. The fact is that in Uganda, when we borrow money, it doesn't go for that intended purpose. It either go to other channels, hence the problem that we are dealing with. And also the issue of taxation. Would it be wise to tax citizens to smithereens instead of what other countries are doing, offering stimulus packages that are helping revive businesses?
Oh, okay. When it comes to stimulus packages, I know that Uganda has tried to give several stimulus packages, but a lot of them are not known by the public. The public doesn't have information about them to access, because I don't believe that most of the SMEs, know that there is a facility that they're able to access. So that is one of the main challenges. Then as an economy, we're not as big as maybe the US economy, and you find that when we are borrowing money, for example, we have to offer a much higher interest rate. Then, for example, the US government, when it borrows, the US government is able to almost borrow at zero. So they, as a nation, have a much bigger capacity to give a stimulus package to their citizens, a generous stimulus package to their citizens. But while we look at these stimulus packages, for example, in the US, when you give this money, it also has implications of possible further future inflation, because you're giving out money for free. So all these things do have an economic implication, yes.
And do you think the rising inflation in Uganda itself will have an effect when it comes to the financing of this budget?
Inflation, yes, inflation will always have an impact. You want there to be some inflation, but not too high of an inflation, because when inflation rates are high, you have to offer higher interest rates when you're borrowing. So the government does have to borrow at a higher, to match with inflation, so that people can get returns that is matching with inflation. So definitely inflation does have an impact.
Indeed.
It does have an impact, but our inflation rates have not been so worrisome yet, no.
They are worrisome, according to some tax experts and economic experts. But then we need to address production challenges, access to health and education, a population boom. You wouldn't believe in 2020, in Kampala here, we would be 4 million during day. And then at night, 2 million, meaning the population was increasing during day. You had people migrating from other areas into Kampala, 4 million, and then the residents keep around 2 million at night. And then there's also a population boom. Many children have been born and so forth. So you have these challenges which lead to grappling in access to health, education, and also the population boom. So we need legislative and policy direction from these new leaders. Are they up to task, Kaiser?
I think these new leaders have just come into office, so We need to give them a chance to see, you can't get into office
No,
and
not necessarily our news leaders, but the leaders. Are they up to task?
the leaders. What we have to realize is when Uganda, we're dealing with a different dynamic, we're dealing with a population which has its own characteristics. When we want to talk about, okay, we're getting resources and the resources are not going, like we're raising revenue, but it's not going into its intended purpose. We do have a culture of corruption in our country that is very much inbuilt within the society. So it's not something you can look to and say it's just about the government leaders. It's about each and every one of us in the population and how we are accustomed to doing things. So if that is to change, then it will mean an entire change of culture, not just a change of leadership. Yes, which will not happen overnight. So it is something that we have to deal with. I've seen it's been talked a lot about by the Minister of Finance and also by the President himself. So it is a current problem, but it's also a cultural problem.
Well, much of the money that is going to finance our budget, Peter Chamba, did not come from the external sources. Over 1.3 trillion shillings was missed from external sources. So largely, we are focusing on domestic resource mobilization. That's why we are saying 20.8 trillion out of the 44.7 trillion budget is coming from taxes. That's what we are talking about right now. But are there any alternative sources of resource mobilization that could go a long way in financing our budget instead of taxing our citizens to smithereens?
Okay.
Or a state of nothingness?
I don't think it's, of course, it's not a state of nothingness, and that's why, other than, of course, taxation, which, for now, the issue would be, how can we widen the tax base?
Tax more.
Widen the tax base would be to get more people who are supposed to pay tax, to pay it, who are able and are supposed to pay tax. That is one of the ways which, in my view, has to be focused on and which government is focused on.
Or create jobs for the 78% of this population who are grappling with unemployment so that they could start paying taxes.
Definitely, that is another way, okay? And that's why, when you look at some of the tax measures which are put in place, there are some measures to promote industrialization. And the measures which have been put in place to promote industrialization are meant to get more people to invest in that area so that there would be creation of jobs. Because we know that the people who actually employ massively are industries. So that is one of the ways of having policies that would help to create jobs for people, and that way then you would have money going through the economy. And of course, the other aspects would be to create incentives that would help to encourage people to start their own businesses.
But with these proposals means that government has given up on efforts to widen the tax basket. So they are focusing on only the tax measures.
My view,
It seems like it's the only option they know. Let's tax.
My view, it is not, government has not only focused on taxing.
Seriously, 44.7 trillion shillings of the budget. 20.8 trillion is coming from taxes. It is the only avenue through which they think they can get money.
Why I'm saying they are not just focusing on tax, because generally, if you look at all the countries around us, 20.8, as I told you, is a very little percentage to GDP. So which means we are still below where we are supposed to be. And as such, that means as Ugandans, we are not yet paying enough taxes based on the kind of revenue that we are earning. And because, as I said, 20.8, as you're saying, is only about 13 point something of the GDP, which is below the average, which is acceptable, of about 16 and above. So, which means there's still room if we can get more people to reduce on the burden on the few who are paying tax. And that is one aspect. Then, when you look at the measures, as I've said, there are a number of measures which have come in for purposes of, one, widening the tax base, which I'm talking about, to help more people who are supposed to contribute to the coffers. There are a number of measures that have been put in place and policies for purposes of encouraging investment into the country,
All right.
and also encouraging people to start up jobs and to develop a number of sectors which can help to kickstart the economy and ensure that there is sufficient revenues in the country.
Peter Chambade is a tax expert from KPMG. I also have Susan Kaiser. Let's talk about alternative sources for funding for this budget. Wouldn't it be wise for this government to create more jobs for the unemployed youth so that they can actually be enjoined in the tax bracket instead of taxing those who have formalized in the system to smithereens? What do you think, Susan Kaiser?
Well,
Instead of taxing those who are in the formal tax bracket, wouldn't you be in a better position by widening the tax bracket, by ensuring that Romeo Busiku, who is not working, Peter Chambade, who is largely grappling in Gulu, is actually getting a job somewhere so that they can start paying taxes? Isn't that a model of widening the tax base, creating jobs?
Okay, that is true about creating jobs and widening the tax base. But what you realize is a lot of people in the country are earning and they're not paying tax. So when it comes to widening the tax base, I think there has
It's
been...
because you've not helped them to find the jobs. Now they're doing it themselves in the informal sector.
In the form, but
yes,
the
and that's why
informal-
it's hard for you to tax them, because you've not streamlined.
It's not
the
that
industry.
it's so hard. It's that there's a lack of political will to tax.
Lack of political will.
Yes, to tax the informal sector. The informal sector can be taxed, but there's a lack of political will. You know, why are we taxing maybe the borders? Why are we taxing these people? So it's more of a lack of political will. Yet it's true that we need to widen the tax base and run them in, because you're borrowing money to finance things like roads, and these roads are going to areas where people are not paying tax. So because you've borrowed money, you need to pay back this money. So in the creation of jobs, you need to also, there needs to be an element of taxing the people who we have felt that we should not be taxing. So I think the problem is more of a political will rather than a lack of policy.
Well, of course, you talked about the roads. We are building a road in a rural area where people are largely in subsistence farming. They won't be using it to transport anything at the end of the day to the market, because it's largely going back to the household.
Yes, yes. And so a lot of the roads are going into areas, they're not utilizing the roads to a certain extent, and they're not paying taxes. Yet we have to pay back this loan. So we don't actually have revenue. Okay, roads don't really give you immediate revenue, but we don't have revenue coming from these areas to pay back on the borrowing. So then we're coming back to this formal sector, the small formal sector, which the system is already established, and we want to tax them more. So I think that is where a problem comes in.
Would you agree that one of the solutions would maybe be creating more jobs for our Ugandans, in that way increasing their purchasing power? You get the point? In that, if I have purchasing power as a Ugandan, I'm able to go buy goods, buy commodities from that producer, who in turn shall be borrowing loans to actually increase their production based on the demand coming in from the citizens. Many citizens are demanding my product, so I'm borrowing from a bank. So do you think government's only strategy should be increasing purchasing power of Ugandans?
You see, when you say increasing purchasing power, there has to be a policy of how to go about this, because how are you going to create that
Let's
job?
talk to the policymakers.
How are you going to, you're saying, okay, let's create the jobs. How are you going to create the jobs? Most things need a financing component. For example, if someone wants to start up a business, they'll need to get a loan from the bank. Interest rates are high. So we have to look at policies around all these things that make it easier for someone to be able to either employ themselves or be employed. We can look about, because if our savings capacity is low within the economy, so we're looking at a source of financing is people's savings. They are the investors in the financial markets. So because of our source of our savings source is low, because our income is low, we can look at tapping into investment from the foreign direct investment from abroad to fill that gap. So when we have the foreign investors investing in our country, then we look at they are able to set up the industries that will employ people. So there are several policies that have to come into place. It's
And
easier said than done.
I agree with you that creation of jobs is one way of increasing purchasing power.
I hear you, Peter.
And I fully agree, and that is something which we need to focus on more.
Indeed.
I think government has also tried to focus on it through provision of financing to young people, through the microfinance support, through the Myoga, through. So that is a way of availing avenues to create jobs for people. We have the agriculture funds. We have so many aspects which may not be enough, definitely, in the circumstances, but I think the focus is there, but we need to focus on it more so that we
Indeed,
can
Peter
enable.
Chambade, and someone might look at this conversation and say, no, it looks simpleton in nature, but then you are releasing over 500,000 potential taxpayers every year out of the universities and other tertiary institutions, 500,000 every year, students, and they are grappling with unemployment. So that is a tax base you're not tapping into, but if you had to create jobs for the 500,000, that money will trickle back into the economy. I don't see why the policymakers don't see this as a very good strategy.
If I could say something about our education system, if we look at maybe India and China, for example, they decided to specialize, maybe investing in education, in technology, in certain technology. So when a company wants to set up in China or in India, like Apple, they have that skill base. They have a huge pool of talent into that skill base. So they're willing to invest as foreign investors in China, in India. So we have to look at, okay, we're churning out these graduates, but what are they learning? At the end of the day, when they come out, are they what the employer wants? Are they what the investors want? Is this the quality of labor that they want? Is the quality of labor applicable in today's world? Has it moved with the times? So you're talking about that. Yes, it's true, we're churning out graduates, but what are they learning? And is it in tune with what we need? Yes.
All right. Are they getting the jobs and are they sustaining them, which in turn will help them pay the taxes? Because some of them only last 6 months and then they go back to being unemployed because they didn't have the skills because of the education.
Yes.
You understand? Thank you. Let's assume you're in that room where you have all those leaders, compounding more on what needs to be done in this budget. Where would you put your focus?
My focus would be on areas or sectors that would help to produce more.
I understand. Which are those?
And some of the areas like agriculture, because as we are all aware, the biggest population, almost 80% of our population is within, basically depend on agriculture. So to the extent that we can focus on that sector, and
Parish
then
development model.
Yeah, and work on the entire value chain so that we do not only stop at the primary production, but work on the entire value chain, ensure that once production has been done, storage is there, the market is there, value addition is there, then we would have a bigger part of the population getting something into their pockets, which is going to improve the economy of the country as a whole.
All right, Susan Kaiser, where do you see growth coming from in this budget? Let's project the future in a minute before I let you two go.
I think the fact is, we're really coming out of COVID and okay, I've looked at maybe the parish development model. They really want to go out into the local community such that we have a spread. So what I'm hoping for is that if we have a spread of resources such that we're not so dependent on, Kampala as a source of revenue. We'll wait and see how that works out, the parish development model. If we have, less dependency on the central region as a source of revenue and more diversity in terms of where, our revenue is coming from around the country.
Susan Kaiser and Peter Chambade, many thanks for having made the time to talk to us about this very pertinent conversation. How largely we can finance our budget through 1, financial markets, and 2, taxation. Thank you very much. You couldn't have been more spot on.
Thank you.
Indeed. And that's it for this edition of Morning at NTV. My name is Romeo Busiku. This is the #1 breakfast show that is big on first-hand information. If you're not watching this show from Monday to Friday, you're doing a big disservice to #1, yourself, #2, this nation. My name is Romeo Busiku. Cases of COVID-19 are rising exponentially, now kept at 55,511. So the biggest bet for ending this pandemic or even curtailing the spread is by wearing a face